No, I'm not running out of content, and this is not a desperate attempt of just raking in some views with the Sony versus Canon hype. I was seriously considering switching all of my Canon gear to Sony. So much so that I had everything already in my shopping cart. 2 bodies, a bunch of lenses, as well as the accessories. At the end of the day, I decided against it, and in this video I want to tell you why I'm sticking with Canon and not going for the Sony FX6, although on paper it's an amazing camera. But at the end of the day, it didn't sway me enough to switch from Sony to Canon. This is not 100% a review because I didn't have enough time to shoot with this camera to be really able to do a full review of it. So this is just basically the reasoning why I didn't buy it. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Pixels. So why did I even consider switching in the first place? Because I have a lot of Canon camera gear and I'm actually quite happy with it. But I also got a lot of jobs recently that require me to run and gun with a handheld camera, a shotgun microphone, following around people, and sometimes switching it up to a gimbal. And yes, my Canon cameras technically cover all of this, but I have different cameras that cater for different needs. My Canon C300 Mark III is an amazing camera for bigger productions. It shoots RAW, it has SDI out, but it's not a great gimbal camera, and it's also a little tough with choices when it comes to lenses because it's a Super 35 sensor, and if I shoot with a lot of people in my frame, I'm always having a hard time finding the right lens for it. Whereas my Canon C70 is small, lightweight, it works well on a gimbal. With a speed booster, it's basically full frame, so I have more choices when it comes to wide angle, but I'm missing out on RAW, I'm missing out on good media recording formats, and I don't have SDI. Technically, on paper, the Sony FX6 covers everything. I also hate having choices and always having to make the choice which camera I use for what. So in theory, with the Sony, I can just buy 3 of those and then have the same cameras that cover everything. And that would be a near perfect scenario. So let's go ahead and talk about the body a little bit. Although I really do think that the design of the camera is quite ugly and it looks like a camcorder from the 90s, and I never really gotten into the whole gray finish and all the weird looking buttons on the side. But since it's not about the look of the camera, let's talk about the ergonomics. And here I was pleasantly surprised, to say the least, because this camera is really lightweight, which saves my bag when running around for hours and days at a time, shooting in different kind of locations. So that is definitely on the plus side. I also really enjoyed the side handle, which you can easily switch from different kind of positioning if you're shooting low angle, mid angle, or even in higher angles. And you have all the buttons that you need. For my liking, I even had too many buttons on there, like the zoom functions that I would never use, but overall I really did enjoy shooting with this camera. I could go with a couple more customizable buttons. All the buttons that were there were actually pretty functional and I would use all of them, but sometimes I was missing some customizable options when I just wanted to get into a little bit more specific different kind of settings. So on my Canon cameras, I definitely have more buttons to customize. I also really do like the Sony's form factor because I'm a big fan of traditional style cinema cam bodies, and the Sony features that, especially with V-mount options from Tilter, where you can basically just hook up a V-mount plate to the original slot and then use V-mount batteries with it, because I'm also a big fan of powering your external monitor with the V-mount batteries. But speaking of external monitors, and here is where it gets tricky. I never use these stock monitors on any of my cameras because I shoot a lot outdoors. I am focusing manually most of the time, so I need a big bright monitor. And the one that comes with the Sony, although it's technically not bad and I like the touchscreen options, is something that is too small and not bright enough. So I would never use it and get rid of it immediately. So what I usually do is I take a third-party top handle, attach a 7-inch screen to it, and then call it a day. With the Sony FX6, that is a little tricky because then you're missing all of your audio inputs. You don't have any. not even a 3.5mm headphone jack, so you are stuck with the original top handle. And that was something that I immediately discarded the Sony FX6 for when it first released, because that is usually a no-go for me on any of all of my other cameras. When actually shooting with the Sony for the first time, I really did enjoy the top handle though, and I was pleasantly surprised with it. It also features a lot of buttons like a record button or some customizable options. So that is something I really did enjoy, which I really didn't think in the first place. So if I would have gotten the camera, my setup would have been the original top handle with a 7-inch screen on top of the top handle, get rid of the original monitor, and then have a V-mount battery solution on the back. And I think that would have been a near perfect balanced camera rig. And since I mentioned that I need a shotgun microphone, I was really confused about the shotgun microphone holder on the Sony FX6, because in theory it should work great, but none of my XLR microphones fit in there because it was just way too big.
For some reason, this shotgun holder doesn't fit any of my microphones. Like, I have a couple of different XLR microphones, headphone jack microphones, and this is way too big. I don't know what to put in here.
So either I would have to purchase a dedicated microphone just for this camera, or need to work with spacers or gaffer tape, and that is also a jerry-rigged solution that I really didn't like. There is a really big no-go to the whole situation though, and that is that, as I've already mentioned, if you take the top handle off, then you're missing all of your audio inputs. Which is fine for shooting handheld, because as I said, I do like and enjoy the top handle, but it doesn't fit on a gimbal. So when shooting on a gimbal with this camera, I would have had to take the top handle off and then be left with basically no audio inputs whatsoever. And that is a big no-go, and that was one of the biggest reasons that contributed to me not getting this camera. Most of the times I'm recording audio externally anyway, so it wouldn't have been that big of a problem. But just not having the options to just do a run and gun gimbal setup with a shotgun microphone is an absolute no-go, and that is something that I couldn't just work around with, and I wouldn't want to have a shotgun microphone mounted to an external recorder and then having to sync everything for everything when shooting on a gimbal. So overall, that is something that I really didn't like. I heard that Sony is coming out with an XLR option that doesn't require the top handle, but at this point this is nothing but rumors, and as it stands right now, this is a really big no-go for the work that I do. So yeah, I don't like that at all, and I really don't understand Sony's choices when it comes to that. Next up, let's talk about the internal ND filters, because this was a big selling point of the Sony when I was first considering it, because again, I do a lot of run and gun these days, and having variable ND filters electronically built into the camera is an absolute dream. Don't get me wrong, I do like my internal ND filters on all of my Canon cameras, but having to go 2 stops at a time oftentimes is inconvenient. Plus, while shooting, I can't really switch the ND filters because it just looks ugly. Whereas on the Sony, I could just slowly increase and decrease the amount of ND filters, and most people wouldn't even notice. So yes, the ND filters are great, but there is a bit of a caveat. Number one, well, I do shoot between no ND filters and 2 ND filters a lot, because I shoot a lot of sunset and sunrise situations, or sometimes indoors. So there I still have to enable the electronic ND filters, which you would see showing up on the footage, so there would be no advantage to the Canons either way. I also always heard great praises about the auto ND. When I used it, I really wasn't that big of a fan of it. I was using it here in the studio with a lot of windows in the light, and it always kind of tried to expose for the entire room, making my subject that was actually in focus way too dark, and I had to raise everything manually so that you could actually see my subject's skin. So for me, I would probably not use the auto ND, because I'm trying to avoid any kind of auto settings on any of my cameras, just to have full control and not have the camera mess up, but it's still nice to have it. Another caveat about the ND filters though is that they're not strong enough in a lot of situations. I like shooting wide open with all of my cameras, and I'm also shooting in mid-sun a lot. We're actually on our way to Mexico in 2 weeks and then to Las Vegas afterwards. And if you've ever been to any of those places, there is some pretty strong sunlight. So I'm oftentimes in this 8 to 10 ND range, and since the Sony NDs only go up to 7 stops, that might actually become a problem, because then I have to stop down the lens, and then again I'm not really gaining anything over my Canon cameras, and it's basically just a wash. Next up on our list is the overall image quality, and obviously this is subjective, but I've always liked Canon colors. I always liked the image that it produced. And then when switching to the Sony, I never really liked Sony's image. I was a Sony shooter once, and again, I didn't like it. And most of the stuff that I saw online, I really didn't like either, so I wanted to see for myself if I really do like the Sony when it comes to the color science and the overall image. First off, let's talk about the sharpness. The sharpness coming out of the Sony FX6 is amazing. It's pretty nice, it's a pleasing image, so if you're into sharp images, then the Sony has you covered. It's not overly sharp like an 8K sensor coming out of the R5 or a Red Monstro, but it's a pleasing, sharp image that you can totally work with, and I give it a thumbs up. Dynamic range. Here I was a little bit confused because from what I read online, everybody seemed to be on the conclusion that the dynamic range of the Sony cameras were basically on par with all of the Canon cameras. And that I really didn't think was true. When comparing both my cameras, looking at the waveforms in S-Log 3 compared to C-Log 3, you could immediately tell that the Sony had a lot more contrast baked in, and even when grading the footage, I could also tell that the Canon just has a lot more dynamic range than a Sony. Since I wanted to rule out some user mistake, I went online and tried to get this confirmed, and I saw some lab tests that actually confirmed this, and the Sony has roughly about an entire stop less dynamic range than all of my Canon cameras. And since I think that dynamic range is one of the most important parts when it comes to image quality, that would also be somewhat of a no-go for me. Colors and color grading. Yes, there's a lot of talk online about Canon versus Sony when it comes to colors. And unfortunately, I think that is true. I do prefer the image coming out of my Canon cameras straight out of the gate. I like the warm colors, obviously this is subjective, and I'm having an easy time of just converting everything to an image that I can work with. Whereas with the Sony, I feel like it's a lot harder, and a lot of the times I just didn't like the result that came out of the camera in the end, even with doing some color grading. And when I liked the results, it definitely took me more time on the Sony than I would on the Canon. And that brings me to my color grading workflow, which is really important when it comes to the choices of my cameras, because again, we have a lot of fast turnaround projects, and shooting for this YouTube channel also shouldn't take too much time to be more efficient. With my Canon cameras, I use C-Log 2 exclusively, and I just use the original Canon conversion LUT. I slap it on top of all of my footage, and I already end up with a very decent result. After this, I use one of our Canon custom LUTs, and you can find all of those down in the description below. We have ones for Canon as well as for Sony, but just applying these to my footage and setting it to about 30 to 50% usually does the job, and I'm very pleased with my image. Whereas with the Sony, I had a hard time finding a conversion LUT. I downloaded some third-party ones, I also downloaded the ones from Sony itself, and none of them looked really the way I wanted it to. Most of them had too much contrast, some were just completely messing up the colors, and so far I haven't found a conversion LUT that actually works and makes my workflow a lot easier. But what it comes down to in the end is what image do I prefer? And overall, when I've been doing all of my side-by-side testing, I always preferred the Canon cameras. And here in the office, I asked Belle, I asked Franco, and we were all on the same page. I showed them comparison footage without them knowing which was which, and all of them 100% chose the Canon over the Sony every time. So this is obviously a big factor when it comes to choosing a camera, because you need to like the image coming out of it, and all of us are pretty confirmed we do prefer the Canon. As our last category, let's talk about usability and workflow, because there were a lot of little quirks that I really didn't like about the Sony that I didn't know about before getting the camera. So let's start here. No false color. And this was something that I really didn't expect. The Sony just doesn't have it, and false color is the exposure tool that I use 95% of the times when looking for great exposure on all my cameras. Of course, you can use the baked-in one from the monitor, but I was really surprised that the Sony didn't have it, and I would much prefer having it in camera instead of on an external monitor. No peaking over SDI, or HDMI for that matter, and that is also something that I was really surprised about, that when using an external monitor, you won't be able to have peaking show up on your monitor. So why is that? That makes no sense. And again, you can use peaking of your external monitor, but I always prefer having the internal peaking because the ones on the monitor sometimes are a little iffy, and it also shows up on all of your menu settings. And again, I would much prefer having this in camera. Recording options. This is also something that I didn't know about. When shooting on the Sony, you only have one option if you want to shoot in 422 10-bit. If you want to have a long GOP, for example, and you want to have smaller file sizes, there's no option of 10-bit 422, and you need to go down to either 8-bit or 420 footage, which is also something that I'm not a big fan of. So eventually, the footage would end up twice as big as on my Canon C70 or on my Canon C300 Mark III when I'm shooting in the lowest bitrate possible, which I end up doing a lot for this YouTube channel, or even some fast around client work, because I otherwise end up with way too many terabytes that I care for, and that was also a no-go because file sizes do matter. So here's my final verdict and the ultimate reasons why I didn't get the Sony. Number one, and that is probably the biggest, I just didn't like the image. And that is purely subjective, and overall I just prefer my Canon cameras when it comes to the overall image quality. Number two is the entire top handle situation with the audio inputs, especially when using it on a gimbal. That is something that is also a big no-go for me and contributed to the fact that I wouldn't switch over to Sony from my Canon cameras. And the final reason why I didn't get the Sony over my Canon cameras were all of these little quirks that I just told you about. The missing false color, no peaking over SDI, the lack of the ability to have a lower sized codec, as well as the ND filter only going up to 7 instead of 10 stops. So at the end of the day, it's an absolute amazing camera and you can create amazing content with it. Me personally, I'm still swaying to over all of my Canon cameras, as many of these quirks they have. But at the end of the day, when it comes to my workflow, my kind of work, I think I'm better off with Canon. What about you? Let me know down in the comments below what would have been the number one reason why you would choose the Sony over basically the Canon C300 Mark III or the Canon C70 with a speed booster, or any other camera for that matter. I'm quite interested in what would be your unique selling point of getting the Sony over any other camera. Although this wasn't a very thorough review and more of a little rant of why I didn't get to love the Sony as much as I wanted to, but maybe you still liked it, maybe you learned a little bit, and if you did, then please hit that thumbs up button because it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more content, and I hope to see you on the next one.